The power of the remembered word. Francis Yates, a British historian in 1966, wrote a book called The Art of Memory. It was a revolutionary book about memory techniques and their relation to the history of philosophy, science, and literature. In her book, she states that we moderns have no memories at all. It's a quote from the book. Where once Mnemosyne was the venerated goddess of memory in ancient Greek times, we have turned over responsibility for remembering to the cult of the computers, which serve as our most modern mnemonic idols. The force of the remembered word in oral traditions, such as our own indigenous people, the ancient Greeks, and in the Jewish tradition, to name a few, has given way to the inarticulate hum of the disk drive. Memorization in the archaic period of Greek history, 12th to the 8th century before Christ, was more than a mere device for keeping facts straight, more than an efficient storage and retrieval system. It was a way of getting and staying in touch with the past that would otherwise be consigned to oblivion. It was a fateful fending off of forgetfulness. Human memory has become self-externalized, projected outside the rememberer into a non-human machine. A computer, however, as we all know, cannot remember. All it can do is record, store, and retrieve information, which is only part of what human beings do when we try to remember something. Further evidence of memory's declining prestige in our society is found in other places as well. Memorising, once a standard pedagogical tool in primary school, is no longer part of most children's experience of school. Who remembers their times table? Come on. Yes. Okay, 7/8, what is it? Very good. Go to top of the class. You get a lolly at the end of the lesson. And who can remember slabs of scripture that we had to learn at Sunday school, and so you could win the prize at the end of the year? Educators in the past believed that the very activity of memorising, beyond providing a shared cultural tradition, was beneficial to a child's mental development. We don't have to return, of course, to such practices, but the point I'm trying to make is that their absence reflects a general devaluation of memory. And of course, you can find exceptions to that. In 1985, the Guinness Book of Records recorded a Buddhist monk as the record holder in the human memory class. Bandanda Visesara recited 16,000 pages of the Buddhist scriptures from memory. And when I was chaplain at Toorak College many years ago, I used to visit a grandfather of one of my students. He was a soldier in World War II and was in a nursing home run by the RSL. He suffered from dementia, and often when I visited him, he'd be fast asleep and would awaken only briefly. The visit would sometimes consist of a reading from the Psalms, but on one occasion I thought I'd try something different, and I started to sing "Onward Christian Soldiers." He opened his eyes and he joined in word for word, and then went back to sleep. In spite of his dementia, he retained the memory of those words. It is a fact worth pondering that psychoanalysis, so often regarded as a form of memory therapy, was much more concerned with forgetting. Although his offsider Brewer and Freud together proclaimed the cure of symptoms by the cathartic recall of traumatic experiences in their book Studies on Hysteria in 1895, Freud became convinced that his patients' memories of seduction were actually fantasies disguised as memories. Psychoanalysis, of course, can be said to consist in a continuous struggle against the forces of forgetfulness. Forgetting pervades even those situations in which we appear to have every reason to remember. I attended a funeral a week ago of a dear friend of mine. I'd known her since she was 7 years old. And those of us who gathered at the Ballarat crematorium honoured Gillian's past. And part of the purpose of the funeral, of course, is to recall her personal traits and various memorable events of her life. At the same time, however, the mourners are sanctioning each other to begin to forget the loved one as we say the words, "We're laying her to rest," as if that's forgetting her. And yet, almost paradoxically, the Gawa people on Elcho Island in Arnhem Land of the Northern Territory, the mourners blacken themselves and live together for a set period of time in a house of forgetting. They reminisce about the loved one and their life, and then they prepare themselves for their eventual return into the separate lives from which they came. It is the gentle art of forgetting. And yet we know that those who suffer from PTSD, and when those traumas return through some trigger that has happened in a person's life, and particularly true of returned soldiers, of course, rather than being people of forgetfulness, they suffer from too much remembering. In 2000, Edward Casey wrote a magisterial book called Remembering, a Phenomenological Study. In this book, Casey introduces us to 3 ways in which we use our memory, or models of memory, he calls them. He talks about 3 ways in which we use our memory. First one is reminding ourselves, second is reminiscing, and third is recognising. Reminding stands for clues that guard against forgetting. So we have photographs that remind us of an overseas holiday or family events, postcards, diaries, receipts, and in this way, these signposts guard against forgetting in the future. By reminding us what is to be done, they encourage us not to forget to do it, like feeding the cat or the dog. Our lives are awash in a sea of externally presented, constant reminders that answer and defend us against an equally encompassing sea of forgetting. And then there is reminiscing. This requires more activity than reminding. It can occur personally, like when I meet my brother in St Kilda occasionally for a cup of coffee and we reminisce about the old times when we grew up in Ballarat. It consists in making the past live again by evoking together with others. You can't do this on your own. Each helping the other to remember shared events or knowledge. The memories of one person serving as a reminder for the memories of the other. Do you remember when? Do you remember you? Do you remember we? And of course, school reunions are a great place for reminiscing to occur. To relive the past in reminiscence is not merely to represent to ourselves certain experienced events, it is rather to actively re-enter the no longer living worlds of that which is the past. And we are now rememberable through reminiscence. And of course, we know that in communal reminiscing, the main characteristic is that all of those sharing in the reminiscing must have shared the same experience. Do you remember when the congregation voted for such and such? Shared experience. And finally, there's recognition. Through recognition, what was evasive and ambiguous becomes intact and settled. Through recognition, the question as to the identity of the person towards us is resolved. Let me give you an example. On a trip to England about 10 years ago, Catherine and I landed at Heathrow Airport, and we were to have been met by her cousin, who she hadn't seen for many, many years. And it was only when this dishevelled man started trying to pick up our luggage that she finally recognised him, rather than some stranger that's trying to nick off with our cases. Recognising must involve the past in some capacity if it is to count as remembering. In the reading from the Jewish scriptures, which Lorraine brought to us this morning, we have an event of remembering. I don't regard this story as literal history, but the author obviously wanted to convey the story of a return of the Jewish people to their religious heritage after many years in exile. And in the third quarter of the 5th century BCE, there was a thoroughgoing reorganisation of the Jewish community which clarified its status and saved it from disintegration and set its religious direction for the future. The reform was accomplished by two men, Nehemiah and Ezra. Nehemiah gave the Jewish community political status, and Ezra reorganised and reformed its religious life and focus. So around 485 BCE, Ezra arrived in Jerusalem and Nehemiah followed. The picture that confronted them and the community was that the community had lost its way. Low morale was everywhere, people were dispirited, disillusioned, and this had led to religious and moral apathy. Priests were bored with their duties. They saw nothing wrong with offering sick and diseased animals for sacrifice. The Sabbath was neglected and given over to business and other activities. Non-payment of tithes meant that officials like the Levites had to abandon their religious duty in order to make a living. There was real danger that the Jewish community would disintegrate. In short, the danger was that if the community did not find its moral and religious compass, it would lose its distinctive character. Jerusalem lay in ruins, so it had to be rebuilt. And of course, the first thing to be rebuilt was the temple, the centre of religious and national identity. And then, of course, the next pressing problem for Nehemiah was the provision of physical security, so the walls around Jerusalem had to be rebuilt. But Ezra's task was different. He had been sent on this mission by the Persian king Artaxerxes I, and his task was to complete the community's religious education by reading the law, the Torah, and reintroducing their religious ceremonies and rituals. And in the reading that we had, we find that the Torah was being read publicly from a wooden platform erected for the purpose in one of the public squares. And Ezra read from the scroll of the Torah from daybreak until noon. To make sure that the people understood what he was reading, he and his assistants gave an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew text, section by section. And as the people heard these remembered and recognised words, they broke down and wept. These remembered words were so compelling, so powerful, and so full of authority that they became, from this time on, the foundation of the religious and cultural life of the Jewish people. On a personal level, our memory then plays a central role in our sense of identity and of our being. Our pains and joys, our feelings of grief and contentment are not simply dependent on the events in our lives, but also, and even more so, on the way we remember those events and experiences. Different people will remember a similar illness, accident, success, or surprise in very different ways. And much of our sense of self derives less from what actually happened than from how we remembered what happened. And we've embedded in some way those memories into our personal history. It is not surprising, therefore, that many of our emotions are closely related to our memory, as when the Jewish people wept on hearing and remembering the forgotten words of the Torah. When we feel remorseful, it is a biting memory. Guilt is an accusing memory. Gratitude is a joyful memory. And all such memories are deeply influenced by the way we have understood and integrated past events into our way of being in the world. So as you contemplate your future as a congregation, you'll need to embrace those traditions and words and activities for which this church is famous for and remembered for. Many of you will have different memories and interpretations of those memories. But as you move forward into your future, those memories will inform and shape the future that awaits you.